Welcome to the online training program on water sensitive urban design and planning again. And today we have webinar 3. So we already had 2 and had good discussion after that. Today with us we have Ms. Jane Eagle, and I would request Kirsty to introduce her and take it forward. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Shivali. Hello, everybody. Nice to be back again. This webinar is a virtual training program. So I think some people may have their mics on because there's a bit of background noise. So if you don't mind just switching your mics off. So we spoke yesterday about the importance of champions in this water
Shivani, can you switch off your mic?
We spoke yesterday about the importance of champions in the whole implementation and adoption of a new paradigm like water sensitive design, and even bringing in sustainable drainage systems. And Jane is one of our fiercest proponents and greatest champions in this regard. She's been working in Johannesburg for many years and has been part of our push through future water that's associated with the WRC in terms of developing a framework and guidelines for water sensitive design in South Africa. So what she's going to do today is give you some of the urban drainage, highlight some of the urban drainage issues in Johannesburg, but also some of the efforts to put in place more sustainable systems, and particularly to think about how we can start capacitating and influencing local development control departments to push it through their influence across the City of Johannesburg. So Jane, thank you very much. We're really looking forward to your experience sharing as always. So yeah, when you're ready, share the screen.
Thanks, Kirsty. Thanks a lot. And hello to everybody. Let's see. Can you see the slide? First slide. Let's see.
Yeah.
There. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Hello, everybody, and how interesting to be having a training course under these circumstances and in this way. Hopefully, there are going to be a lot more of them. It's actually opened up a whole lot of new possibilities because I'm part of the C40 flood group, and instead of each city only being able to send one person, we can now send, 5 or 6, 10. A lot of people can tune in. So this is a new world. Just to give a bit of my background, so as Kirsty's given, I actually started as an urban planner. That's my training. And I then moved into the environmental field, and then I just sort of developed a very strong interest in stormwater, because it seemed to me that there's such a close relationship between urban planning and transforming the landscape, and then how it transforms drainage. So I've never had a formal training. I'm not an engineer, although I often tell engineers how to do their jobs. I've just developed a passion in this because I think also there's very close relationship between stormwater drainage and environmental degradation. So that's how I've come to this, and I did manage water quality and catchments for quite some years. At the moment, formally my job is designated as open space planning, but it's not just about parks and providing parks, it's about really how you manage the landscape. So that's really how urban drainage is located within my portfolio. So I've really called this a presentation, Urban Drainage in Johannesburg, Changing the Paradigm, because it is a very long and slow process trying to change the paradigm in a city, a bureaucracy where things are not that nimble. We're not always well resourced, and sometimes you find yourself alone trying to chart a course to better practice, best practice. So firstly, and this would be common for other cities across the world, but particularly in South Africa, why does managing stormwater matter? Well, because we are a water scarce country, we face increasing periods of drought, and stormwater is a resource. I think it's an untapped resource. It's an often unrecognized resource that we currently just send down the drain. Often when cities are looking at water resilience or drought policies, as Johannesburg has, stormwater doesn't feature anywhere in that agenda, and they talk to water services people, and it's all about pressure and pipes and where you can find more water, and stormwater really gets overlooked. But at the same time, stormwater is causing huge damage downstream in the catchment, so it seems to be we have to change that whole equation. We've also got a very big relationship with our climate change people, because drought and flooding have been identified as two of the main climate risks and hazards for Johannesburg, either too much or too little. And we see stormwater as part of the overall water balance, and it's really critical that we manage it more optimally. And how we manage stormwater is really also linked very strongly to the severity of flash floods and to the resilience of the city. So there's the sort of climate language coming through. We really are part of adaptation and resilience if we can get management of stormwater better in the city, because everyone blames these flash floods on God and the weather, and then I always say, well, God and the weather are two features. We can we might not be able to control those, but we certainly can control how we develop a city, what our urban patterns look like, and how we manage stormwater. So we can certainly build greater resilience into the landscape. Our particular rainfall here in Johannesburg, our patterns are expected to become much more erratic, and we are already getting much more intense storm events that we deal with. So the same rain or more rain over a shorter period. So where have we come from as a city? Well, there's been no explicit acknowledgement of water as central to spatial planning. So we don't plan along water catchment lines. We plan along administrative lines or planning regions which have no relationship to catchments. The hydrological considerations are often overlooked in favor of other priorities, especially in a kind of post-transformation, post-apartheid city, where things like mobility, social inclusion, and economic development are often seen as the greatest priorities, and obviously they are, but things like science and environment tend to take a bit of a back seat in relation to that. So the main focus is always on redress, on getting access to water services, and that's the focus. And we have quite traditional technological approaches to that: pipe water through separate systems for potable water, and then wastewater. And around stormwater, which is seen as not even having anything to do with those other water streams, for years the way that stormwater has been managed in the city was it was just dumped onto a street, conveyed down a conveyance channel, dumped into a pipe, and then dumped into the nearest drainage line, which was basically our rivers, which were called drainage channels. And when they become unsafe, they say unsafe stormwater drains is how they refer to our beautiful, precious rivers. So, we've inherited a situation where stormwater really wasn't well managed, and it was fine while we were very decentralized, and in a way the environment could absorb the shock. But as we've increased densities and our catchments are getting increased, and that's all part of compacting cities in the interest of reducing the footprint, and climate change is seen as a positive thing, but it's having also these consequential impacts of increasing flows. So attenuation, the whole concept of attenuation, holding water back on a site and releasing it slowly in a more manageable way, is quite new, was only introduced recently in Johannesburg. And even when it was introduced, there was this cutoff. It was only introduced for very large sites of over 8,000 square meters. So the cumulative impact of a whole lot of smaller sites that might have been transformed, hard surfaced, built over, has been overlooked. So we had various, I don't know, some of you locally will be familiar with the Blue Book, which preceded the Red Book. And it did require some peak flow management to the pre-development conditions. That was since 1984. And then the Red Book also talks about creating a safer living environment, and it does have provisions to manage the minor systems and the major systems, but it's still very much on traditional lines. So I always show these pictures. So sorry, the next few slides are really just a series of damning pictures on the consequence of either not managing stormwater or managing it badly, or standards that are not adequate to the kind of stormwater that we are getting and the kind of landscape we are dealing with. So we've densified, we've increased the hard surfaces, we've discharged. At the top there is a picture of just showing that's the kind of densification, and then it gets dumped. All that stormwater, no attenuation, gets dumped into those 2 drainage lines you'll see in green there. Sorry, I haven't got a pointer. I realized I should have a pointer. I'll be painted with my finger. And then the consequence for the properties below is what you see in the bottom 2 pictures. The whole dams just devastated, the ecosystem trashed, and the sediment smothering wetlands, etc. So, you know, these are real life situations. And if you're poor, government might step up to help and assist. But if you're seen as sort of wealthy, well, this becomes your own problem. This gentleman on the property below has spent over 150,000 of his own money having to try and stem the, you know, this damage, which happens on a regular basis, not a once-off basis. We have dug up wetlands in Johannesburg. I'll show you just now what the kind of geohydrology we have, but we have disrupted wetlands, often not recognized. They weren't picked up in the development process. You can see on the top right there, we've got whole townships built over huge seep wetlands, because the kind of wetlands we have in Johannesburg, we do have some valley bottom wetlands where everyone recognizes there are reeds growing out of them, but the more difficult, tricky wetlands are the seep wetlands where they're seasonal and often they are unrecognized until they start digging the foundations, and there's the big black mud and everyone's worrying, and they don't always get recognized even in the geotechnical reports, because with all due respect to geotech engineers, they look at it from a different perspective. They look at how can we manage this, what do we need to do to build here. They don't say should we build here. So, you know, the end result is that we end up having to canalize streams, like the bottom left, that's a poor wetland that's now completely trashed and having walls put to protect the buildings. Or if we've got attenuation, even if we've got attenuation and we don't recognize that we've got to discharge in a different kind of way to protect the downstream wetland, then they just dig a channel through the wetland, and that whole wetland there in that picture is a now massacred wetland, which of course is going to erode out and suffer all the consequences. Also, the other feature that really doesn't get considered, and just bear in mind that I come from a planning perspective, so I see in the planning process how, in a way, there are so many requirements, and yet still we miss through the environmental impact assessment process and the town planning process, both are actually still inadequate. They don't call for sufficient assessment of the total impacts of a development on a site. So this is just 2 pictures that came out of our wetland report, and it's just really showing the relationship between the geohydrology and the landscape, and these things have a bearing. You have to consider them in the way that you are developing, and what a development, how it might impact on that northern zone with lots of seep wetlands and lots of baby tributaries is very different from how it's going to, you know, impact on a dolomite zone in the south. So here are again just some damming pictures. This is the kind of development we are getting, and I have to say we are still getting this development. Some of these are very recent, and we get 30 sites in a row like that, not a blade of grass. Everyone will tell you there's 10% greening. You can't see any greening, maybe a little yucca plant in a pot on the doorstep. And then the water just runs off this paving. This is not permeable paving, and it's dumped into the nearest drain. So then we wonder why we have a problem downstream. And these would have all been under that cutoff that I spoke about. And then we also have these horrible, sorry to say they are used and they maybe have a place, and we can talk about that later, but we really struggle with this whole concept of underground tanks, because there's what an underground tank looks like under a madrasa, where we made a concession for an underground tank. That's what it looks like. And half the time, by the time they cover that thing up, it's full of sediment. Its capacity is already taken up with the construction sediment. It's out of sight, out of mind. No one worries about managing it. So the consequences downstream, we get failure of these systems. We get, they damage our tributaries, and then you get secondary impacts like the sewers fail, and then that causes water pollution, or infrastructure gets swept away. Our parks look horrible, like these bottom ones. You know, you're walking through the park, and the park is just the open space where the end of pipe dumps that stormwater. That supposedly complies with all the requirements upstream, but I don't think this is fair to have this kind of consequence on the environment, and it's certainly just not aesthetic, if even at very least. And then there are obviously consequences for people's lives. We get this kind of devastating erosion and threats to homes, whether they're formal or informal. Obviously, some of these might be in the floodplain even. but even those which are deemed not to be in the floodplain would suffer. And these are just more pictures just to show, the devastation on the environment. It's not sustainable. It's not what we should be doing in the way we manage stormwater. We send a lot of sediment down, and sediment's becoming a huge, huge problem, particularly in Joburg. I'm sure it is for many cities. But sediment has a lot of consequential impacts, not only on ecosystems, smothering breeding grounds of fish, but also it somehow finds its way into the sewers. And then we have a lot of our blockages of sewers are actually due to sediment ingress. So sediment is a very strong feature, and you'll see later even in our bylaws. And it links very strongly to, runoff starts its impacts right from the day you clear a site. The impacts are immediate. They are not something you can wait to manage, because they start from day one that you start to transform a site. And here's just the loss on the biodiversity, the pollution loads, and all the other nasties that stormwater carries very effectively into our rivers through the drains. And it hasn't been mandatory by any means in Johannesburg to look after the quality of your runoff. So these are the consequences. And then obviously the flooding. These are real events. These are real flood events that we've had in the last 2 or 3 years. These were by no means off the charts events. I think the top one with the combis was that was a 1 in 200 year occurrence. It's been estimated, but some of the other floods here would be the 1 in 20, 1 in 10, not very, very severe floods, and properties get damaged, etc., and people lose their lives. So here are a few case studies just of some of the areas in Joburg where where this thing comes together and causes a problem. And this is my link between really spatial planning and the consequences of not managing stormwater, and then how it all comes together, and it becomes a management problem at the end of the line. So just very briefly, I'll speed up, but this is a ridge area. They just built over all the ridges, dumped the stormwater in these tiny drainage lines. There were no thought for how they were transforming the runoff of the ridge, and then the consequence is quite evident. You just send it all down that road into a drain, and it lands out in this park and causes that big channel and damages the sewer. It's just, not fun. Here's another one, a big industrial area upstream, no attenuation for properties under 8,000, of which there were many. So in the end, you get a vast complex of industrial development, but that wasn't attenuating, and even those that were not attenuating to adequate standards. And then this is a river system downstream that had wetlands, and that's supposed to be a dam. It's completely smothered, and then it actually starts to threaten pylons and power supplies and all those consequences. Here's another one where in this case it's very much a case of encroaching on the watercourse, not respecting the natural hydrology of the site, digging up the wetlands, only taking floodlines into account, not taking the whole riparian zone into account. And again, this is not an extreme flood event, but we've covered springs up. We just have not listened to the hydrology of the landscape. It's been totally ignored in the planning of that. So that goes beyond just the stormwater issues. It's about how you respect water, and you build an understanding of the natural hydrology of the site into your overall design, so that you don't pick up consequences. I'm a bit naughty showing this slide, and I'm not quite sure if I'm allowed to, because I've taken the top slide from a report done by Digital Soils Africa. I have acknowledged them here, but this just to illustrate the kind of pressure that we're even facing today. This is not then and now. We are still in the trenches with trying to get this balance between the need for development, for densification, for economic development, and respect for the water processes of the landscape. So the top left, I'm not sure that it's that clear, but there are different hydrological response zones linked to, so this came out of a hydropodology study looking at the soils and the water flows, and the blue on the sort of, for you it would be the left of the site, it's the western side, is actually a huge seep area. They call it the responsive zone. And then there are various recharge zones and interflow zones for the rest of the site. But the moral of the story here, the site is full of water. It is a very wet site. On the right is the concept that I can almost be assured will happen on the site. It's the other way around. So unfortunately, the only picture I could find from LinkedIn is this picture of a concept of the new development, and it's a kind of franchise development with an artificial lagoon. And the lagoon itself, if you switch that picture, would land almost largely in that saturated zone of blue. So we'd be digging up a natural wetland effectively to replace it with this artificial lagoon. Lovely development, I have to say. I've been to one of them. They're wonderful, you know. But the problem is this development appropriate for the site? But I don't really want to get into the politics of the development at all, because this is not the purpose of this. But it's more to say, and at least these developers have commissioned the study. But now the question to everyone is, can you mitigate? Can you redesign your, your substrate, your foundations, the management of your stormwater, your buildings? Can you plan around the natural hydrology of that site in a way that doesn't export problems, that doesn't impede flows, that doesn't damage a wetland downstream, and also that harvests water, because they're very keen to know if there's water in the landscape that they can use. There are very deep aquifers here, but then there's also this shallow interflow zone with quite a lot of water. And they have got they've designed a very nice SUDS kind of scheme for their stormwater, which takes water through and around and under and through filtration swales. But, it's about, there's an artificial redesign of the landscape. And I'm just posing the questions. These are the real dilemmas. There's no answer to this one at the moment. Some might just say, go and find another site. But I think this is going to happen. So it's about, how do you manage this so that you don't get cracking houses down the line? And do planners and stormwater engineers really, the questions I put to the stormwater engineer are intense, to say, do you really understand the water balance? How much water? Because the problem is, and that we've actually asked for a phase 2, where the water is going, the fact that it's moving through the landscape, which is that bottom diagram which shows there's a recharge zone and interflow. It's a very simplistic diagram, but essentially recharge, interflow, and then responsive zone. But you've then got to know the volumes, because you can no longer just plan stormwater by looking at the surface landscape and your traditional calculations of stormwater and the catchment and how, with some sort of one-size-fits-all calculations. Because if you miss this water and you've displaced this water, your calculations are totally out, and then everyone wonders why the system fails. So I just raised this because I thought it's quite an interesting case study that we are grappling with at present, which brings together a lot of things that are way beyond just a traditional, let's replace a pipe with a swale. It's really, how do we do holistic development that considers the broader landscape, and it's really, really difficult to do. Okay, so back to Joburg, to speed up also. We really needed a paradigm shift. We still need a paradigm shift. We are starting to make that shift. I think there wasn't a linear route here. We did policies which maybe had other motivations at the time, but that served us well. So we started with a catchment policy in 2009 that was really trying to regulate land use along rivers and floodplains and stop this ongoing encroachment into the floodplains. That was his primary purpose, very much trying to protect the floodplain. Then that was followed shortly by the Wetland Protection and Management Plan and an audit of all the wetlands in Joburg, because we found that the provisions to protect wetlands and manage wetlands only kicked in when you knew the wetlands were there, and half the time they were missed. So we tried to have an audit as sort of to balance out, if we get a development site, we can say you're likely to have wetlands, you need to go and actually do some more investigation. And it also was very strong on stormwater and how you need to manage stormwater differently for your different wetland types. And then we moved on to hydropodology, which came out of work that the Water Research Commission had done, which just made me very excited as a planner, because it seemed to me it takes it away from just the site-specific approach, and it does look then more broadly at the total landscape. And we have a lot of sites where water pops up in a little steep wetland, but you don't really know what's driving that water. So the law puts a line around the wetland and says, protect the buffers, don't build there, you can go anywhere else on the site. But then you might be completely messing up the recharge zone on which that poor little wetland depends. Or maybe that wetland's connected through an underground spring to a bigger wetland. So it's joining the dots. The hydropodology, it's really been an advance that starts to, I think, really help understand the site in its broader context. And then in 2010, we developed new Stormwater Bylaws, which didn't explicitly talk about SUDs or even WSUDs, but they really were trying to tighten up on managing drainage. And they did highlight the need to consider the environmental and the impact on the receiving environment, not just on the discharge off your road, but to having to consider what it was doing to the receiving environment. And also very strong on sediment. There are huge sections about sediment. And then the bylaws also talked about and relied upon having a design manual. And I think the intention in that case was much more on more technocratic kind of designs. The design manual we've ended up with is not just a design manual, so we'll talk a little bit about that just now. And then lastly, another sort of study we've done, which I think adds to the suite of changing some of the thinking, is traditionally Joburg has had, when it did introduce attenuation, it was very much an on-site attenuation for individual sites. That was partly just out of pragmatic considerations, that it's easier for each individual property owner to manage, or complexes to manage attenuation, and it takes the pressure off the local authority and the municipality for having to then maintain and manage larger attenuation sites. But then we had a rethink, because we thought, it's become actually quite a nightmare to police, and half the time these attenuation facilities don't even exist, and we're struggling with capturing them as part of the asset base. So everyone's planning as if everyone else's attenuation is still in place, and sometimes they've been filled up, or someone's just capped the tank and let the water go elsewhere because it gets too much of a hassle to maintain that tank. And then also it doesn't bring in the possibilities of harvesting stormwater. So if you're really starting to look at the possibility of harvesting and actually using your stormwater as a resource, it's much more efficient, just financially often, to do at a larger scale, because you can treat water quality and also in terms of any infrastructure you need to pump it to where you want to use it. So you can get small scale applications, but we wanted to test where, would regional attenuation be a better way to go in Johannesburg? So we got some quite interesting results out of that study. Anyway, so now I think where we've sort of arrived is at our new stormwater design manual, which, as I said, goes hand in hand with the bylaws, give it the legal teeth. But the manual itself played a bit of catch up and really has tried to make SUDs and WSUDs very much more explicit. It's put it at the center. And so it said you have to make space for proper stormwater management. You have, at all levels of spatial planning, you must be already thinking about how you're going to manage your stormwater and building that in. You have to have an idea of what your catchment is like, your total catchment, and that must also influence your on-site drainage decisions. So it's put a bit of pressure on the city now to develop catchment strategies for all our catchments. You must manage your total runoff, and quite a controversial provision which says you actually must take this back to the pre-development condition, and pre-development was almost back to Adam and Eve almost. So that's been quite contentious, with people saying that's just totally unrealistic. But I think it's a sort of an aspirational manual. We're not going to get everything right all overnight, but we are trying to say that's the right thing to do. That's where we want to move, and we have to try and move in that direction. It allows for a lot of creative design, so there's quite a lot of pressure on engineers and landscape architects and wetland practitioners to work together and to come up with optimal designs. It's not one size fits all. It's saying each site is different, your objectives are different, your landscape is different, your flow rates are different, your steepness of your site, the soils, and what, the impact you're going to have. So you must look at each one and design sympathetically in relation to your site, but always follow a precautionary principle. And then another new feature of this is that we are now saying you have to manage your water quality. So I think Cape Town has had water quality in their stormwater regulations for quite some time, but we haven't. But now we're saying you do have to consider what you export from your site in terms of suspended solids, nutrients, and sediment. So that is quite a new thing for engineers to suddenly have to consider water quality. It's not something that a lot of engineers ever apply their minds to, I have to say. And then we've got a requirement for retention, not just attenuation. So it's not good enough just to hold it back and slow it down. We're actually saying we want you to keep some back on the site for reuse. It's the early days of trying to just plant the seed that stormwater is not something you just discard and actually has a place and a role and maybe can be of a benefit to start helping with your water footprint. And we're saying stormwater central. You can't leave it as, because traditionally with planning, spatial planning, the whole plan would be done, the site plan would be signed off, and then you could bring your stormwater plan later because it didn't really affect anything because you were just going to use your road layout and shove some pipes under your roads. Now we're saying, no, if you're going to actually start redesigning and having open attenuation ponds and maybe integrating it with your wetlands or your landscape, and you need space to disperse your water more gently so that it doesn't cause damage to your receiving wetland, that all has a space requirement. So you've got to consider that much earlier in your planning process to make provision for that. It's not the end of the line feature. It's actually core. It might mean you lose some units on your site to get the better overall solution for your site. And then we're also saying we have to start tightening up on capturing any stormwater management, even SUDs, even a swale should be part of the infrastructure assets that are maintained and kept and accounted for, because we don't want body corporates who think the attenuation was actually a sand pit and they fill it up with sand for their kids, which these are real life things that happen. So just a few principles, I'll run through them very quickly. So storm as a resource, catchment recovery, water quality, I've already, these are all self-evident. I think I'll leave you to read those, but these are principles that we are saying must guide decision-making at all times. And the environment is a stakeholder. You have to consider the receiving environment. It's no longer that thing down at the bottom of the catchment. So our stormwater design manual, we see it as a living document as we get research, the kind of research that Kirsty and them are doing, and University of Witwatersrand and others, and best practice anywhere in the world that helps us know what works, what doesn't work. Some of the research that's been done on permeable paving, for example, by Bill Hunt, all these things help us update, review, and add to the manual. So we're saying it's not cast in stone. It's something that we will consider to see. It's a bit of trial and error to some extent, and I'm afraid to say engineers hate trial and error because they have public liability risks. If they design and it fails, that one of the biggest problems around the manual resistance is, if we try your green infrastructure approaches and your new approaches, what if it fails? Who bears the brunt of the public liability and any costs and comebacks? So that has been one of the resistance. So some of the challenges we've had around the manual, just captured on the slide, is skepticism. It can work elsewhere. Well, it works in Norway, but it can't work here in Joburg. We're different. Oh, yes, it can work in Cape Town. It works on that Gulf estate, but not in our low-income housing. We're different. So there's been a lot of skepticism. And then, as I say, these resistance from professionals, because engineers have to go back and learn new skills, actually. They have to create new partnerships with landscapers and wetland people. They've got to consider a much more complex set of variables than often they have done before in designing their stormwater. It was just a few calculations, and there was the size of a dam and a pipe, and then it was all about the specifications linked to hard infrastructure. So I think these green infrastructure SUDS solutions do place a lot more challenges on the professionals involved, and it requires also a much more integrated team. That's not a very easy thing always to achieve, neither in private or government projects. It's time, it's energy, it's working out. They can't just do their bit and hand their report to the landscaper who then dollies it up with a few plants. The engineer and the landscaper have to talk to each other and maybe, debate the best solutions. We've got a major problem with capacity and expertise. So we have a lot of willing people, actually. So even people who are willing and who are quite enthusiastic about the new approaches and who agree that it's the way to go, still struggle with the technical, just how to translate these into solutions. We haven't got a lot of local examples always to follow. So it's capacity and expertise is still continues to be a challenge for us, both internally and externally, because we've also got to have local government officials who've got to assess these projects and then do they have the skills to actually know what they're looking at and ask the right questions? So we've done a lot of work around that. And then we have a resistance from our maintenance depots who love to maintain concrete and pipes and culverts and clear a culvert, but they do not want to have to mow a swale or worry about a sediment. They just say anything green, it's not their business. So that's been quite a challenge, which you have to continue to tackle. And our institutional arrangements in Johannesburg don't really facilitate integration. You have to build relationships, but everyone's got their own mandate with their jobs. It's roads, it's potable water, environment, and to try and integrate those is really a challenge. I've talked quite a lot about the spatial planning and development approvals. They're also very linear, and they don't always create the time to come up with creative solutions. And then a lot depends on the integrity or the willingness of a developer and his team or her team to actually bring the right professionals on board and give them the time to come up with new innovative solutions. Often they're driven by bottom line cost, and we have actually found that there's this myth that these green solutions cost a lot more. Our experience has been often they cost less, and there can be some huge savings actually, and often that, or the need for water, sometimes there's another driver that gets the developers sort of interested. There are practical considerations. Not all solutions can work everywhere. I mean, permeable paving and putting water back into the soil is not always that, practical on our granite soils, which is precisely where we want the water back in the soil, but it can create groundwater problems. So the message we give to engineers is you've actually got to design this thing. It's not just about shoving the water back in the soil. You must manage it, design it to mimic nature, to take it where you want to go in a way that doesn't create your secondary problems for foundations, etc. And then I've spoken about the stormwater, as a resource. People, when we look at these drought policies, we're very busy looking at groundwater and what we can get from groundwater, but really the numbers suggest that stormwater is still a very untapped resource. And we need a lot more examples of best practice that I think start to win a few hearts and minds about what's possible. So I'm going to just end on a case study, which hopefully does suggest that you can get something good if you make a bit, if there's a bit of effort involved. We had the map up there just shows we had a very big seep wetland linked to a sort of a downstream valley bottom system to two main tributaries, but also located at a very rapidly growing development node in the city, one of the biggest commercial nodes. So it was a very unfortunate sort of confluence of conditions that came together here. And this poor little wetland found itself surrounded by this growing urbanization of massive densification, big complexes, and then this huge shopping complex. And it was threatened. They wanted to turn it into a golf driving range. We managed to stop that. But then it just sat there, being eroded out, squatted on, and these slides at the bottom are just showing you what the sort of catchment downstream of this wetland looked like. Complexes were putting hay bales to try and stop it from eating their land. So there was a crisis here. So a developer bought the site, and I haven't got, unfortunately, a site of his first wetland. So this whole development came about almost by chance, because in the planning approval, it happened to say that we happened to have challenged the wetland delineation that was done and said we don't really think that that's right, and it's got the complete wetland, because we knew what this wetland looked like. And so they had to come back to the city's planners, the city's environmental department, to satisfy our wetland conditions. So they got a revised wetland done, which looked like this. And essentially what you're looking at is the wetland had actually increased in size because of all the runoff that had been fed to it from these surrounding big commercial developments. So the site was almost not developable, because with the buffers, you had that little sliver of green left to develop on. So we had to make some compromises, because we either had to live with a wetland that was going to be eroded out anyway. It was being dumped, the stormwater was just being dumped on there, starting to channel it out. There was pollution from sewer spills. So we had to say, look, do we just walk away from this? It's going to become a problem area squatted on, or do we try and come up with some compromises? So I kind of threw out I didn't know if it was a realistic challenge to the engineers to say, if you can mimic the water to the primary wetland, we'll even let you build on the buffers, but the wetland itself must be sustainable. So they came back with a concept plan which didn't look at keeping the entire wetland, but the core wetland was going to be in place. But then they changed it further because they got some hydrology studies done which showed that there was so much stormwater being dumped from the surrounding developments on the site that it would literally have just eroded out. So they said it can't cope. There's so much water coming on the site. The only hope for this wetland is to actually transform the wetland, to almost remove the soil, create these pockets of attenuation dams, and then recreate a kind of a wetland around those, which is this concept plan. So we'd actually agreed to this plan, which we kind of felt was a compromise we had to live with, and at least we'd get some kind of ecosystem, some management of the stormwater. We'd prevent the flooding downstream from the site, and we wouldn't export the damage further down the catchment. And then this is what it looked like in terms of planning, planning site plan. We signed off on this thing. But the moral of the story here, it goes further, is that actually what happened in the end is they took their professional team on site. And on site, they started to even change their thinking about this. They asked some questions. It was cost that drove them, because they were going to have to excavate at huge cost and then put the soil back. That is very costly business. So the wetland guy actually said to the engineer, could we not achieve the same attenuation by raising the sides of the wetlands? So it means the wetlands will be flooded for a longer period every year. They'll be wetter, but we achieve the attenuation. We don't have to massacre these wetlands and excavate them out of existence. We must work with them. And then they've made a way of actually mimicking water through these wetlands. And then also for the major storms, they created, it's just the way they landscaped it, the major storms actually bypass the wetland. So what we got in the end was that about 60 to 70% of the original wetland was actually left on site intact. It remained on site. It was modified. So there was re-engineering, but re-engineering that has resulted in there have been a few critiques. We'll talk about those just now. There are some management issues, but it's really, as developments go, it's a very sustainable solution. And they made decisions on site where they changed things. And some of them were very simple, pragmatic things. So they had this channel just dumping stormwater. There's the stormwater channel that then landed in what is our typical specification for discharge of stormwater, those two wing walls, the big pipe and the few bollockis. You just dump that water on the site, and then what was going to happen was just going to erode. And it was bringing all the litter. So the developer, with his professional team, they actually created this. This is in the making. These are all, during construction. They created this very simple sort of, it served almost like a sediment trap and a litter trap. It was just a gabion wall structure that accepted the water and then also translated that single pipe into a series of smaller pipes, so that the water then was discharged through the wall of this gabion structure, which is the top left there, and then dispersed the water. So what it was doing was saying this wetland never got its water in a single discharge point. It got spread out water, lateral flow. And so we're going to try and distribute that flow and disperse the flow to mimic what the wetland, how it would have got its natural runoff. They had to solve a few practical problems where their structure was eroding, and they had to again mimic the natural hydrology, which would have had a clay layer, which would have forced the water back up. So they had to put in some plastic to do that. And then they planted on top. So at the end of the day, the thing looks very green, but it's, the other message I like to get across is that it was engineered very carefully, but thinking about the principles of the wetland, of the natural hydrology, of the natural soils. How would those plants have behaved? How could they mimic that best to impact least on the site and also to make it the most resilient and stable site, while managing these enormous volumes of water, which were the result of past stormwater lack of regulations. So the water feeds even through their road crossings. They do have attenuation ponds on the side, but they even had to mimic flow under their buildings. So where lateral flow would have fed that big wetland, they had to change their foundations to allow for water to go under their buildings. So this whole landscape has water systems feeding through and under it into the wetland. And there are pictures of this site after a 3-day non-stop rain event where the core wetland was still intact, did not wash out. It was inundated for quite a long time, but then that drained and it came up for air. We have not seen any severe erosion whatsoever. They have got swales, which they've planted up, as I say, and to mitigate some of the immediate runoff from the buildings. But essentially, it's a very livable development, and they got their densities. They got massive densities on the side. It's sold very well, and it's a very aesthetic development with this beautiful wetland in the middle of it. So, you know, it can be done, and it can be integrated, but it takes a bit of effort to make this happen. And I've just realized I actually should have updated that. I've got some even more recent pictures of some of the stormwater swales, etc. So maybe I'll send Kirsty the one with just a few additional pictures, which just show some of the smaller real SUD devices that they put in where runoff has gone, you know, into a rock-lined sort of pond that then seeps. But this is the main structure of that wetland system. So it's just a very nice example of how you can really integrate SUDs at a nice scale into something that satisfies your needs to densify your city, grow your city, and not leave the environment in tatters. Thanks, Kirsty. That's my story.
Thank you very much, Jane. As always, fascinating to see what's been going on in the cities, in your space particularly. And yeah, you know, again and again, we hear this mantra, make space for stormwater management, because, you know, they're just within the planning, within cities, we're not seeing that at the moment. And to do little piecemeal bits and pieces of SUDs or water sensitive design options is not going to help us when we start thinking about that whole urban metabolism, if we are going to try and get towards this nirvana of a water sensitive city. So yeah, thank you. That's been brilliant. I see there
Should I stop sharing here so we see each other, or stop sharing?
Yeah, let's do that. There are a few questions on the chat, and maybe we just go through those unless there are any burning ones that anybody would like to raise themselves. The first one came from Mohammed Lok on the impact of illegal occupiers and settlements on harvesting stormwater. So what would the impact of these illegal settlements be when they are on the floodplains?
Should I take each one as I go? Should I just respond to each one? It's probably just easier because I think they're quite diverse if I just run my... So I think, well, the harvesting stormwater, to my mind, would normally happen in a controlled environment where you've actually designed the system to know where you're going to retain your stormwater and where your takeoff of stormwater is going to be, which would mostly actually result in an improvement, hopefully, for the illegal occupiers, because most of the illegal occupiers are in floodplains. And they're there partly because they can get free water. So it's about reducing the flood peaks that currently threaten them in those floodplains. So I don't really see a contradiction there. In fact, if anything, it should improve it, because one of our goals of harvesting stormwater is, you know, it's got a dual function: reduce the runoff pressure into the catchment and reduce those flood peaks, but also provide a resource. And I think some of the work that's being done by some of the, I think WITS now is also their chemical engineering, you know, there are some, Kirsty probably knows of a lot more, and I think there's some in India as well, where, you know, small scale flood management, you can create even an attenuation structure within an informal settlement that becomes something that's quite useful for reuse. I think it's our friend from the Water Research Commission was telling us about that project in India where they've got a whole lot of small tanks in an informal area where the runoff has been captured in the tanks and then piped, and it was found to be even financially viable just for the water that it was giving them. So I think there are a lot of different solutions, you know, that you can put in place. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the questions. And then
the
maybe
next one, I think, maybe to move on down a bit, because I think the rest was sort of anecdotes about Reservoir Hills. But perhaps what will Stain City and Waterfall City have on this? Are they being built on water sensitive grounds, and have the requisite bylaws been followed up, especially with regard to...
Very sensitive point. That development I've shown you is a site within Waterfall City. You know, Stain City is actually quite an interesting example, and in fact, you have to almost suspend your judgment about what the landscape looked like before, because a lot of these sites, we did these approvals, not we, I won't say, because it's a complex thing of us, province, and, you know, and politics. There were developments built over wetlands. There were wetlands that were missed. There were a lot of grasslands that were traded with offsets. So they obviously were, they were quite contentious, some of these developments. But if you go and look at how Stain City has managed their actual stormwater, I think they've done very well. And Waterfall City to a degree, you know, the SUDS response that they've had to put in place subsequently to manage the runoff that then is associated with their developments has been quite creative and quite green. It's linked to landscaping. They've used a lot of swales, a lot of planted up areas. I think, in my view, Stain City's been slightly more successful, but then, you know, they've got different EAPs and different landscape, you know, it's different professional teams. So, but I think yeah, so you have to almost, the sensitivity, there are certainly still huge groundwater problems in some of these developments where the seep wetlands were not properly understood, and where pathways, this whole thing of, that's why I like to show you that one, how complex the water pathways are, because I think the lines were drawn around wetlands and those were excluded, and the floodplain was excluded, but it didn't necessarily solve all the groundwater problems that were anticipated. And certainly there are a lot of very clever engineers sometimes living in these developments who are flummoxed by the groundwater issues that emerge. So, you know, it just, to me, reinforces the need to have a much more holistic, broad view. And I think our legislation, it's trying to change. You'll find hydropodology is now creeping in. I know Water Affairs is starting to increase the need for hydropodological studies, because the wetland was one step, but it wasn't far enough. What was feeding the wetland? You have to understand what's feeding the wetland. That's just an expression of water in the landscape somewhere. So this, trying to get this greater understanding into our spatial planning, because everyone's working on different mandates. So spatial planning is compacting the city. They've got housing demand, mobility, economic growth. You know, how do you put all these pieces together? So that would be just my answer on that one. And then I don't know, the next one, you got a question to follow up? Sorry, I see Suresh with his hand up.
Jane, I was asking because from a planning point of view, because you are a planner, I had a question that if you have created in the master plan, suppose your last case study, a site which is earmarked as a third party right to develop, as if that something has gone wrong seriously in the planning process stage itself, but you are only now doing reactive by measures of you know, controlling the development when you give the approvals for building plans and all those?
I don't think so. There was a master plan. There's a very huge master plan, and there were a lot of technical reports. But I don't think that traditionally planning reports would look at the geotech. And as I said, a geotech says you might have water inundation in your foundation. So here's what you need to do when you build your foundations to prevent that. But they're not looking holistically. It's looking, it's about the perspective that you take to that development. So there were wetland reports.
The second question is that you are talking about the surface water flows. Does the planning in South Africa look into the subsurface dimensions of the water?
Well, it's starting to. I don't think it's done enough of it. As I say, I looked at it purely from a foundation geotech point of view. How do you need to design your foundations to manage this water? And they would always have a liability clause in the township. This is subject to inundation, so please follow your engineers. This may be, they would say, this site may be subject to inundation. Follow the engineer's specifications. But no one ever went and, you know, sued anyone for that. So I think this whole notion of looking at a broader site and then looking at the hydropodology is a very big advance, because it's the hydropedagogy, to my mind, that starts to link the soils, the water flows, and the volumes of the water that maybe were found in those test pits. So I think it's more of an evolving science, not that it's wrong, because I can tell you this happens also in other countries. You know, when I sit with my counterparts in the C40, you know, it's traditional, good old-fashioned planning. So I think it's more that it's an evolving science. We learn more, and that some landscapes are more sensitive than others, depending on their geohydrology.
But do you cover these by impact assessments, environmental impact assessments?
Yeah, absolutely. But you must understand, and I'm afraid I'm a cynic, an impact assessment, you know, it largely depends on the quality, the caliber of the practitioner, the questions they ask. And, you know, sometimes as local government officials, we actually are on the back foot, because I might not be the specialist, and here comes a practitioner with a big fat report. You know, who am I to question it? So I think you can obfuscate a lot in professional reports, with all due respect. So the law is not perfect. It tries to ask the right questions. We certainly try and ask for the right studies. We are not always the specialist. You know, peer reviews is something we would like to use more of. So, but it's quite hard. You don't, even professionals are a bit reluctant to question their peers, because they're all working together. We're quite a small community, you know. So these are all the real challenges. The intentions are good. And then politics plays a huge role. You know, you guys are holding up development. You green guys there, you want to save a frog, and people need houses. I mean, what's that, you know? So there's a lot of that. So I think, but there is increasingly, there's also, the last thing if I could say about, there's an institutional, I haven't really touched on Joburg's institutional setup at length. But if you look at Durban, I think is a much more successful city. And certainly I'm seeing it evolving overseas as well, where there's a lot more integration between the engineers dealing with stormwater and the land use planners and the managing of the overall catchment. We are still in silos where we've got the roads engineers typically traditionally dealing with stormwater, and then the town planners, and then the environment. And institutionally, you need to bring those people closer together, because otherwise what happens is the people signing off on a stormwater plan are not the same people being called to respond to the flooding and the erosion. Then it's an environmental problem. What are you guys doing to fix the river? We say, well, we didn't cause it. No, but your environment, you must fix it. So it's not, you know, if I can use an analogy, it's like if you're discharging into a downstream catchment and you're the same people who have to, you know, abstract that water, you're going to worry about what pollution you're putting there. We don't have a closed loop of accountability, and it's an institutional problem. And I do think it's something I wage war on daily, and hopefully I'll manage to transform the institution before I retire. But I think that's a real problem.
Very interesting to see. Yeah. We go through the same situation in India also, I would say. We are at same stages across, you know, different continents, you know. We are in the same stages of enabling framework. We have policy framework, but on the ground, there are some people doing some reactive or, you know, piloting, but however, there's a long way to go. So I leave other, I think there are questions by the participants. We can catch up later here.
So there, I mean, we are almost at our finish time, but there are a couple of questions still.
Can I just, I'll try and deal with them very quickly. The stormwater, we are mostly looking at new developments, although I'm told that the Water Act allows us to look at retrofitting. But it wouldn't necessarily be the stormwater manual. Those are more project planning. So something like our regional attenuation study is potentially trying to look at retrofitting some of our stressed locations in the city. So that's almost other project work that we are doing to see whether we can use green infrastructure to help. I don't know if people here are familiar or ever heard of the Copenhagen Cloudburst program, but where they looked at how they manage flooding through retrofitting parts of the city with green infrastructure, or tweaking, you know, creating a little bit more attenuation capacity throughout the city. So that would be the kind of project we would look at for areas where stormwater has really had a negative impact, or we're just fixing crises where we have to go and shore up a bank with gabions, etc. But those are less well favored by us, because we do see them as rather crisis management and not always sustainable. Is there a recognized green belt? There are a lot of green belts. We have quite a lot of green areas. I think our bigger problem is trying to keep the ground we do have and not let it get paved. So it's not so much that everything's paved now, but it's becoming paved, as I showed you from those photos. And what we're trying to do is say, that's another planning issue that Suresh might be interested in is, you know, we have minimum requirements for greening that are seen as a climate, sort of almost a climate greening requirement on a site. And I'm saying, if you're clever, you can meet your open space requirements, your greening requirements, and your stormwater requirements, and your heat mitigation, you know, all together. If you put your heads together, because there's space saving, so your minimum greening is also giving you opportunities to deal with your stormwater in a greener manner. But it requires so much ingenuity and integration, and we found that people really look a bit gobsmacked. Occasionally you get a professional team who rises to the occasion and comes with a really interesting response. But often this is really stressful for the professional team who are not used to having to talk to each other, work together. So we're trying to do that, to put the water back into the ground. It would definitely be part of now what the bylaws and the design manual would advocate, in the right way at the right time, not so that you create a problem for your neighbor's building by shoving your water in and now suddenly they get a damp problem they never had before. Spluma, yes, we are looking at Spluma, and we would certainly like to make some changes to our Spluma bylaws, which we don't think went far enough in terms of, they're much more framed in terms of traditional town planning. And we do think that there are some provisions we could include there that would improve how we look at things. Our new Spluma, our land use management system that responded to Spluma has created an entire chapter for environment. But again, it's this practical disconnect that almost by giving environment its own space with its own provisions, they've almost halved it off into a corner. So if you don't go looking for it, sometimes you don't get that integration. So I think how you craft these things is very important. And then lastly, this one, any workshops? Yes, we've had endless workshops with engineers. We've probably had about 6 or 7 over the last 3 years, and we had a major one with SASI last year, and we are planning more going forward. And a lot of the engineers there are working with SASI, I think, to look at how they could maybe change some of the lecturing to tertiary institutions, because it clearly does start there as to who are you training and what message are you giving to your up-and-coming engineers. And I have to say, our resistance originally from this paradigm shift came from the elderly engineers, the tried and tested, skilled, been in the profession for many years. And it's the young engineers who are showing a lot more enthusiasm for saying, this is the way to go. We're very excited by this paradigm and we agree with you. So we've got a lot of support from young engineers, but they are definitely wanting more skills. They're saying, help us to, comply. And then would you say effort? Stormwater is a resource. It's a bit slow. I think we might be forced into looking there if we hit another drought. So I'm just trying to get some of the number crunching, because numbers and money, you start to turn your harvested stormwater into rands and cents. That is when it's going to be taken seriously, I think, when it becomes much cheaper to retain, treat and reuse your stormwater than to have to buy it in. So hopefully a lot of the work that Cape Town and the water unit, New Water, Future Water is doing will also help us there. And then, yes, the Pan-African Parliament, very sore one to bring up, because I think that new site that I've just shown you has some shades of the Pan-African Parliament site. So I don't want to get into the politics, but definitely some similarities there. And then, yeah, it is difficult. I agree with Mongi. That is a big, big problem. And you're 100% right. Clients do not want to pay for it. It's difficult for engineers who are assuming public, liability, professional, their professional indemnity, will it pay? And we maybe should look at the discount fees. I don't know how that would, we have applied our minds to this. How can we help the engineers? At the moment, we mainly just put pressure. We often say to them, bring your client to the meeting and we'll tell your client, you're not going to get this approval. So it's a little bit of blackmail and pressure to say, you want a quick approval, you're not going to get it unless you actually bother to pay your professionals properly to do the work that we are telling them they need to do. So often it's better coming from the regulators than it is from the poor professional engineer who's not got the same clout with his client who he's bound to for his contract. So yes, we would like to try and help, and that's a topic I think we should pursue. It's definitely a lot of food for thought, and you're spot on. With efforts moving fast or slow, planning approval. You know, one of the other things, just to say, on the resource, we've got a few studies where, so one of the things the new Stormwater Manual does is it says, you've got to, if you're going to have an underground tank, you can't just have a big hole in the ground and dump your stormwater. You have to have some co-benefits, and one of them is you have to retain water for reuse. Now they think, well, why are we going to reuse this? Where? How? So it sparks a whole chain of events of thinking. But also, we then start to say to them, do a bit of a calculation on the amount of water that this complex can save that offsets the potable water. And obviously, again, it's who benefits. It's not the developer who's going to benefit from that, it's the future residents. But if they start to translate that into benefits that they can include in their marketing, like, are you aware that we actually can store so much water in this development, and it's going to mean your water bills going forward for the complex are, you know, a third less than otherwise. You know, we're hoping that the monetary, the economics of it will also start to make the case for harvesting stormwater, and that seems to be where we get our most traction at the moment. And Witkoppen was cheaper, Catherine who's listening. And I don't think necessarily because it was a SUDS development, and it wouldn't necessarily be the same for every development, but that particular one saved that developer 4 million minimum, because he, instead of excavating the wetland, so stepping back and paying his professionals, and this is the point I make, which ties to the earlier point. I say to that developer, so you're going to spend maybe another R1 million on professional fees, or not even that, maybe, let's say, 400,000 for a few more hours to your professionals. It's the cost of, you know, it's an eighth of the cost of one of your sites. And for that, you save 4 million rand on your overall development because they came up with a better solution and you gave them the space and the time to do that. So it was definitely cheaper because they didn't have to excavate and cart soil in and out, which would have been hugely expensive. So I think that's the last question. And you're welcome to, anybody who's got further questions, you're welcome to, Kirsty can give you my email. You can always talk online by email, over the phone, whatever. She knows I'm very passionate about the topic, so anyone who likes to engage on these issues, I'm open for engagement. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Jane. That's brilliant. And we will have a chance to obviously talk about this more in the course next week when we have our 2 days of contact time. We can engage more in these sort of more direct issues around SUDS and implementing water sensitive design. So Shivali, do you want to close?
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Jean, so much for this informative session. We really enjoyed it, and you quickly answered and you catered to all the questions. That's wonderful. Yeah. So with this, we end this webinar, and I would just like to inform that all of you will receive separate Zoom link for virtual trainings tomorrow at your email. You'll receive separate link, and that link will be used for 2 days. That is Tuesday and Wednesday, which is 21st and 22nd of July. And we hope to see you, all of you there. And thanks for being really interactive in today's session and taking active participation. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Wonderful.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Jane. Okay.
Pleasure. Bye. Thanks, Kirsty.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jane. It was a very interesting session. Looking forward.
Thanks, Suresh. We'll chat further. Thanks.
Sure. So thanks. Bye, Christy.
Bye-bye. Bye for now.
Thanks, Shivali, for